talk a bit about working memory. I'm going to address some cognitive psychology theory, so Itiel touched on cognitive load theory, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Then I'm going to talk about the use of sparse slides and some research that I have done. And at this point, there are some people smiling in the room, and I hope so, because if you've got down to the bottom 2 bullet points, and I think you have, apologies to people at the back of the room, then you'll realise that you fall into my little trap here. If you got there before I did, which is to say if you're reading the last 2 bullet points before I had finished really addressing the previous points, you're illustrating my point for me, namely that when you show a lot of text on the slide, people will skim read it and get to the end much faster than you can possibly talk through that information. And consequently, there's this issue then of a divorce, if you like, between what you're saying and what they're reading. And as I'm going to argue, this is less than ideal. So I think what we need to do actually is rewind and start the entire presentation again without bullet points. This actually says rewind, if you're wondering about that, but it says it backwards. I really like this. It's kind of art. So how many people are familiar with Edward Tufte? Hands? Oh, a few people. Okay, thank you. Edward Tufte has made a chunk of his career out of information design and out of analysing things like PowerPoint and saying, well, hang on, actually maybe this is not the best way. And he talks a lot about the sort of the cultural imperialism of PowerPoint and of the bullet point on slides. And yeah, he's absolutely right in many regards. He criticises it very fairly. He says a lot of really, really useful things about, for example, the ratio on the page of ink to information, which is a great idea in itself. How efficient are you being with your communication? What's the ratio of ink to information on the page or on the slide? However, I think he also shoots the messenger a little bit. I think he also is too harsh on PowerPoint, and I'm here to say that PowerPoint, and indeed non-PowerPoint equivalents, so I'm using Keynote today, not PowerPoint, slideware in general is often bashed unfairly. But we do have this problem, is that many people do exert death by PowerPoint. I can't remember who said this originally, but there's this whole idea that bullets, don't kill people, bullet points kill people. And I think we've all experienced, to some extent, being killed by PowerPoint at some point. And it demands, that you read, either you read or you listen or you try and do both. And we know that it's cognitively really expensive to do what's called task switching, where you read a bit, you listen a bit, you read a bit, you listen a bit. It's expensive for your brain and you're squandering resources. I'm going a bit off-road here. I'm sorry, these are not in the slides that I sent, but I found this yesterday and it's too good not to share. So we'll come back to my scheduled presentation in a minute. This is a friend of mine called Pat Lockley showed me this. This is great. Does anyone know what this is? Obama's speech. Right, which one? State of the Union. Great. Okay, so this is a Wordle. If anyone's not seen these are great. Wordle.net. You put a body of text in and it gives you something like this, where it shows the larger the size of the word, the more frequently it was used in the body of text. So as you say, this is Obama's State of the Union speech, and he's talking about jobs, people, new things. He's trying to motivate the country. He's trying to lift the country and say, we must go forward from here, we must improve. Great. Now, what NPR have done recently, National Public Radio in the US, is they asked about 4,000 people, what 3 words do you remember from Obama's speech? This is what people remembered. There was a thing, he talked briefly about salmon and about legislation and the need to rationalise legislation. This illustrates for me, this is Jonathan Margolis's point from this morning. People are human, people are people. People remember salient information. They do not remember what you hope they will remember. So you can give the best speech, you can provide the best education and training materials, you can deliver it in the best way, and they might still remember salmon. One tiny salient detail. So this is a disclaimer in a way, and what I want to argue is that the death by PowerPoint approach, it's not great, but blaming PowerPoint is, I think, it's not totally fair. It's probably not evil, because people are flaky. I've just demonstrated people are really flaky. People's memory is really flaky, and their attention to particular details is unpredictable. So please don't shoot the messenger. I would now like to conduct a very brief experiment with you, if you'll let me. So, because that's one of the things that I do as an applied cognitive psychologist, I'm going to show you some information and give you 10 seconds to memorize it. And then I would like you to see if you can recall it. So, here you go, 10 seconds. Okay, now, can you just turn to the person next to you and see if you can remember what was just there? Okay. I think there were about 11 pieces of information there. How many people remembered 11 pieces of information in the right order? Oh, well done. How many people remembered less than 10? We'll come back to that. How many people remembered less than 10? How many people remembered fewer than 5? Okay, not bad. You're doing okay. What I'm trying to illustrate here, and we'll come back to you people who remembered all of it in a minute, is that the principle that your memory for new pieces of information is limited. And traditionally, this was referred to as the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. So the idea that we can only remember of new pieces of information, we can only remember about 7, give or take. This, I've got to say, this piece of research is 50, 60 years old. It's a little optimistic. Newer estimates say perhaps we can only remember about 4 things, 4 new things that don't really have any context or meaning. That's not great, obviously. How many of us design training and learning interventions where we're asking people to memorize huge, huge volumes of new things? So we need to think about the context in which we give information. We need to think about the amount of information that we present at any one time. Let's come back to this now. So if you've written it down, if you want to just check your answers. How did you do? Now, for those of you who remembered all of that, well done. That will serve you well and probably has already served you well in life. Or you may have stumbled on my secret plan. If I do this, does that help anyone? When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore. Okay, thank you. Right. Now that we know what this means, it's 1 piece of information, not 11. Great. We just did a thing called chunking. So we've chunked all of this together, and now we know what it is, and we can remember 3 or more other things. Let's do something else. Have a quick read of this for a moment. Okay, does this make any sense? Put your hand up if you think you know what's going on here. Oh, 1 person. Excellent. 2 people. Okay, good. Everyone else make any sense? Yeah, sort of, kind of. Okay, what do we think it's about, the people who put their hands up? Oh, so you think that the message here is basically put stuff in groups, okay? Yes? Packing suitcases. Excellent. No, but very close. Anyone else? Ironing. Is it laundry? Right. Okay, this is about doing the laundry. Let's have some context. Have a look again. Now, when you know this is about doing the laundry, suddenly it makes complete sense. You have context. And what we find is that it's very difficult for people without that context. If you show people this sort of text and then say, right, tell me what that was about, tell me what it said, tell me where particular words were in the paragraph, they can't do it because it lacks context, it lacks meaning. And so when we tell them this is about doing the laundry, their recall of the information is much better because their understanding is there. They have the context, they understand. And so this ties into an idea called the schema. And the schema is really just a story or idea about how things work. We all have a doing the laundry schema. We all know that you have to go and put the stuff in the machine and don't put the light-coloured stuff in with the dark-coloured stuff and so on. So this activates, when we see that this is about laundry, it activates that schema, the how to do laundry schema. And so we're relating new information to information that we already knew. And that's how people remember information, by tying it up to their previous knowledge structure. So, for example, this is my conceptualization of how schemas work. I know this is a little outdated now. This is Christmas. We've had Christmas. This can be Christmas 2011. So how I think about this is, in order to add new information, the new Christmas decorations to your tree, there must be a tree. And you must be able to see the tree, or at least feel the tree. So what we need to do is make sure whenever we design any kind of information delivery exercise, the learners are aware how the new decorations relate to the tree. Otherwise, they just drop and shatter on the floor. It's a slightly laboured metaphor, but I hope it illustrates the necessity of bridging the gap between the new information and the old information. And so often, I don't think we pause and take the time to say to learners, hey, how does this relate to what you knew before? Or even, tell me everything you know in this general domain, so that we can attach this new information to what you already know. So I'm going to talk a bit about cognitive load theory, which Itiel touched on before. And this is a theory. It's very hard to demonstrate empirically, but it's a nice model. And I think it will illustrate, I hope it will illustrate for you, if you're not already familiar with it, why it's important to think about some of the ideas within cognitive load theory. And to do this, I have chosen the humble bento box. So who likes Japanese food? Oh, quite a lot of people. Who hates Japanese food? That's okay. Please bear with me. I hope this won't be offensive to you. So in a bento, you get lovely food, and you might get some vegetables or a salad. You'll get some prawn things. These are not bunnies that I have captured in pastry. These are prawns. You get some sushi, and you get some salmon and some teriyaki sauce or something like that. And this is great if you like all of these things. If you don't like salmon, or you don't want salmon, or you really, really like sushi, maybe you can persuade them to replace the salmon with sushi. But the amount of food that you receive is basically the same. So you can't get a sushi extension built on to the bento. What fits in there is what fits in there. Let's think about this as working memory. So working memory, which some of you may know as short-term memory, is the route via which new information comes in and then is either discarded or stored in long-term memory. It's a short-term thing, and it's limited in its capacity, so hence my comparison with the bento. And we can really think about working memory as containing a few different things in the context of learning. So to start with, you're going to fill up your working memory with the intrinsic difficulty of the task. How complicated is this thing that you're asking people to do? And you can't do anything about this. Complicated things are complicated. So my students have complicated material to learn. They learn about statistics, for example. A lot of them find that complicated. And I can't do anything about its intrinsic difficulty. What I can do, however, is modulate how difficult I make the delivery. So another thing taking up your attention, or your working memory really, is how complicated the delivery of the material is. Some of the load on working memory is useful. This is good work that you want, good load. This is when you're building your schemas. So it takes an amount of working memory to actively connect the new information with the old information, or to hang the decoration on the tree that was already there. So this is good work that you want to do. And if you're very lucky, you have a little bit of attention left over for daydreaming or whatever. But we know that when the intrinsic difficulty gets bigger, gets greater, we have less time for daydreaming. We all know this. You experience this, for example, if the traffic suddenly gets very, very busy, you turn the car radio off. Sometimes you have to just accept that the intrinsic difficulty of a task has become more, so you have fewer resources for other things. Sometimes the delivery uses up more of your working memory. Sometimes you're asking people to do things in a very, very complicated way. And sometimes you're asking such a lot of the learner that the amount of attention, the amount of working memory that you have to build schemas, to flesh out your existing knowledge of the world, gets cramped, gets compromised. So really the goal of good learning should be ideally that you want to maximize the amount of working memory that people have available to build schemas and to develop their understanding of the world. So we can't do anything about intrinsic difficulty, but we can at least constrain the amount of space that delivery takes up. And cognitive load theory basically just talks about these things, but it talks about intrinsic load for difficulty, it talks about extraneous load for the delivery environment, and it talks about germane load for schema building. So germane is kind of the good working memory load, if you like. So the goal of learning, any learning environment really, should be to reduce the extraneous loads as much as you can so that there's more space left, more capacity left, really, for allowing people to build their schemas, to connect the new information with the old information. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of research that I and my colleagues at Central Lancashire have done. The first thing that we did was we said, okay, we'd like to reduce the amount of cognitive load that delivery places on the learner. And being lecturers, a lot of what we do is standing up and talking with slides. So we made a video. We set up some slides and we wrote a slide presentation, and then we recorded a narrative over the top, so an audio voiceover. So we made this little video with slides and a narrative. And we had three conditions. We had a traditional condition where the slides were traditional bullet points with some illustrations, but a lot of text on the slide. And this is about advertising science, by the way. We wanted something that people wouldn't really know very much about. We had a second condition where the slides transitioned more frequently, but the slides had less on them. So at any given moment, when I'm talking to one of these slides, you're only seeing what's on the slide, and I'm only talking about what's on the slide, rather than my talking about one of several things on the slide. So you're not asking the learner to split their attention. The last condition was very similar to that, but we added in some diagrammatic assistance. So we tried to represent things pictorially where possible. And what we wanted to know was how much information from the presentation would people remember when we tested them afterwards. So what we found was that the graph illustrates the number of themes from the presentation that people recalled afterwards. We asked them to write a summary of what they remembered. Now, this is not perfect, obviously, and we tested them right away, so we didn't test their long-term retention. But what I think this illustrates is that traditional presentations were not as good. So when people had a lot of text on the slide, they recalled fewer themes from the presentation than when people saw the sparse text, perhaps because we weren't asking them to transition all the time between what was on the slide and what was being said. You'll see that the two sparse text and sparse text with pictures are pretty much identical. The differences are non-significant. But the differences between traditional and both of the sparse text conditions were significant. That is, we're 95% certain that we observed this result because of our experiment and not just due to chance. The second thing we did was we said, oh, okay, this is fine, and maybe in an e-learning context, this is helpful. You know, sometimes in e-learning, we get people to watch little videos and stuff. Let's take it into the lecture theatre. Let's do this for real. So I stood up and gave a lecture to two separate groups of students on separate occasions with the same script, but trying to read it as naturally as possible. So it really was like a short lecture. And then we tested their retention. And we tested slightly different material because this was for the students' benefit, so we talked to them about how cognitive psychology can help them recall information for their exams. We had the traditional slides where, again, there's quite a lot of text on the slides, but also the graphics are crammed in there. And then we had sparse text where we minimize the amount of text and focus on diagrams or just a few words. We didn't bother with the sparse text and pictures because we had already established that that doesn't seem to make much difference. And again, we wanted to know how much of this information do people recall afterwards. And here again, we see that the traditional condition where people had looked at lots of bullet points and lots of text on the slide, those people recalled fewer, significantly fewer themes from the presentation, different number of themes this time because different presentations, more complicated, than the people who saw the sparse text. So again, this suggests that putting less on the slide seems to improve people's memory, at least straight away afterwards, for the amount of information that was there. Really interesting stuff. So we're coming back to this idea of intrinsic load and extraneous load and germane load. We think we've managed, by this use of sparse slides, we think we've managed to actually reduce the amount of extraneous load. And potentially what that means is people have more working memory available to build their schemas, to decorate their Christmas trees, to flesh out their existing knowledge with the new information. As I said, it's just theoretical, but it would account quite well for the findings that we have here. So let's come back to this. I said before that people can maybe recall somewhere 4 or 7-ish new items. There's a bit of a hack to get around this, the fact that the brain is limited in its sort of initial processing of new information. Because actually what happens, two things about this diagram. One, this is not an actual brain. Two, it's not to scale, just in case anyone was wondering. It's not even my brain. What we have is in this part of the brain here, I'll spare you the neuroanatomy lesson since time is short today. This deals with auditory function and language processing. And that has its own little working memory store, and that can hold on to information. But also we have over here, this part of the brain processes visual information, pictorial information, and that has its own working memory store. So you can actually get around, to some extent, the limitations of working memory by farming out different information to either the linguistic and auditory areas of the brain or to the pictorial areas of the brain. So you can expand, if you like, the amount of information that someone might be able to process and hang on to and store in long-term memory.
Got 5 minutes, Chris.
Thank you. So let's come back to this death by PowerPoint, really. When people are experiencing death by PowerPoint, dying a slow death in your seminar room, really what's happening in the brain is that this part of the brain here is overloaded because you're asking it to process written language and auditory language. This part of the brain has nothing to do because there's no pictorial stuff, there's no easy, grabby visual stuff. And by that, I don't mean putting clip art in your presentation. I mean really thinking about how you tickle both areas of the brain at once to maximize the amount of working memory that people can spend on learning. I want to leave you with this picture here, really. Just there you go. This illustrates for me quite nicely the problem that we have. When we see pictures of the brain, our critical faculties switch off. If someone writes a paragraph of text and say, brain scientists have found that or whatever, and then says something, it doesn't matter. There's actually scientific evidence to demonstrate that when you start talking about neuro this and psychology that and whatever, it doesn't have to back up your argument. People still go, oh, right, and they rate whatever you're saying is more credible. That's quite scary. There are a number of people and organizations and whatever that have sort of co-opted prefixes like neuro, where actually there's no evidence that anything different happens in the brain as a result of the intervention. So I urge you all really to be more critical and more evaluative and more doubting of all information, anything that purports to tell you that, oh, this is brain science or, this is science or whatever, including this presentation. Please critically evaluate it. Come back to me and tell me that you think I was wrong or careless or inaccurate. Please do not let your critical faculties switch off when you view pictures of the brain or text about the brain in any way. That's it. Thank you very much. If you want to talk more about this, this is where I am, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chris.
Sorry, do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes left, so we've had two very engaging and interesting speakers, and I don't know how your cognitive load is at the moment, but if you can bring up some great questions for Chris, who's just spoken, or indeed if you've got any hanging over for ETL, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer. We've got about 3 minutes before we break.
Yes, the gentleman in turquoise.
I'd like to ask you, Chris, is a pretest a useful tool in helping people to get in touch with what they know already? Does it help them to build schema?
Could you say more about what you mean by that kind of test, please?
Yes, something which helps people to become more sensitive and aware of what they already know than they might be if you don't give them some kind of pretest.
That's a really good question, actually. I would think so. I don't know about the evidence for that, but I'd be surprised if it didn't work. What I do with my students is I don't necessarily give them prior exercises to work through, but when they come into the classroom, I often say, right, tell me everything you think you know about this topic. And then that warms it up a little bit, but it also allows them to examine their own knowledge. And so then I try and relate the next thing to what they've just said. Does that address your question okay? Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
That was very interesting, thank you. Could you enlarge a little bit the discourse towards long-term?
Sure.
Measure over years.
I can't say with my own results here because we genuinely didn't measure that. I would be surprised if there wasn't a small amount of long-term benefit, but it might be quite small because this was a short presentation, easily forgotten. Maybe there would be better. I think there would be better recognition of the information where people just say, "Oh yeah, I saw that before," but not necessarily better spontaneous recall of the information. So without having done that study, I can't really say. I would like to think so, because the whole idea really is if you free up more working memory, then you expect better encoding in long-term memory. But also you have to consider, well, how often do people revisit that material to revise it and so on? If they never do, then maybe it'll just decay. Charles Jennings was talking about Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve yesterday, where if you don't refresh the information, it just decays over time. Thank you. Yes? Good question. Sometimes I think the personality of the presenter is at risk of overwhelming the content. But also sometimes, if you're not sufficiently engaging, then people switch off anyway. I think there's probably a sweet spot in the middle there, but it's quite a forgiving sweet spot because you can manipulate that. You can use all these tricks. Have people read the book Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath? Orange cover, great book. And it talks about how to make information sticky. So you can make information sticky with no regard for your own charisma, because you can think about, well, is it surprising or is it in some way memorable? Is it funny? There's a lot that you can do with information. And relating it back to people's own experiences, I think, is a central plank of that as well. Do we have any more time?
One more.
Gentleman at the back, yes, please.
Is there an ideal slide-to-time ratio?
My line on this is always, the only rule that matters is the rule of attention. How are you holding your audience's attention on any given slide? I hate rules. I don't like the 10, 20, 30 rule. I don't like the 1 slide per minute rule. Some of these will at some point be true for some people, for some audiences. But if you say to people there is a rule about what you should or shouldn't do, they will use that as a guideline, but actually it will become a noose and they will hang themselves with that guideline. You have to always ask yourself, why is this keeping people's attention? If not, can I make it keep people's attention? And if I can't do that, should I be doing something else instead? So I really feel that the job of any speaker, anyone communicating and using, say, visual aids like this, needs to be, how am I holding your attention right now? How am I wrangling that? Because that's what you have to manage, really, isn't it? Does that address your question okay? Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm sure both Chris and Itiel will be happy to take further questions over lunch. And just remains to thank both speakers for a really engaging morning. And lunch is outside, and we reconvene at 2 o'clock, guys. Thanks very much.
Thank you.